The maintenance corridor of Station Varkle hummed with the sound of failing life support systems. Emily Brooks wiped sweat from her forehead as she crawled through the narrow access tunnel, her toolkit clanking against the metal floor. Her knees ached from 3 hours of crawling through tight spaces, and her uniform was covered in grease and dust. The station was old, a relic from the early days of the Vrelian Concorde's expansion, and it showed in every rusted bolt and flickering light panel. She shouldn't have been in the forbidden sector. The access codes alone could get her fired or worse. But the environmental readings had been driving her crazy for weeks. Something was pulling massive amounts of power from somewhere deep in the station's core, and nobody seemed to care. Her supervisor, a nervous man named Peterson, had looked at the reports and told her to ignore them. Orders from above, he'd said. Don't ask questions. Emily hated that attitude. Back on Earth, her father had taught her that if something was broken, you fixed it. You didn't just ignore problems because someone told you to look the other way. So here she was, crawling through forbidden territory with borrowed access codes, following a power signature that shouldn't exist. The tunnel opened into a vast chamber that took her breath away. Emily stood slowly, her legs shaking from the long crawl. The chamber was enormous, at least 3 stories tall, carved from dark stone that seemed to absorb light. But that wasn't what made her freeze in place. Chains, massive glowing chains as thick as tree trunks, stretched from floor to ceiling, wrapping around something enormous in the center of the room. They pulsed with a strange blue light that cast dancing shadows across the walls. As her eyes adjusted to the dim glow, Emily realized what she was looking at. Her breath caught in her throat. A dragon. Not the fairy tale kind from old Earth stories. This creature was real, terrifyingly real. It was at least 30 feet long from nose to tail, with a body covered in scales that shimmered like starlight even in the darkness. Its wings were folded against its sides, bound by layers of glowing chains. The dragon's head was lowered, resting on the stone floor, but even in this defeated posture, the creature radiated ancient power. Its eyes were closed. Emily took a step forward, her boots echoing in the silent chamber. The chains hummed louder as she approached, and she felt a strange tingling sensation across her skin. The quantum energy, she realized. These weren't ordinary restraints. They were drinking power from the dragon itself. That's where the energy drain was coming from. The dragon's eyes opened. They were golden, bright as twin suns, and they focused on her with an intensity that made Emily want to run. But she didn't. She'd come this far. You shouldn't be here, human. The dragon's voice rumbled through her chest like distant thunder, so deep she felt it in her bones. They kill those who wander where they shouldn't. Emily's hands trembled, but she forced herself to stay calm. She'd dealt with angry Vrelian officers before. She could handle a chain dragon. Probably. I'm maintenance, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. I go where the problems are. The dragon studied her for a long moment. Up close she could see how thin he was. His scales, which should have been gleaming, looked dull. The chains had worn grooves into his body where they pressed against his flesh. When did they last feed you? Emily asked. The dragon's eyes widened, just slightly. It was the first real reaction she'd seen from him. Why would you care? Emily looked at the chains again, at the way they seemed to drink the very light from the room. She thought about her father, about the way he'd taught her to see people instead of categories. This wasn't just a prisoner. This was someone suffering. Because you look like you're dying, Emily said simply. The silence stretched between them. The dragon watched her with those ancient golden eyes, as if trying to solve a puzzle. Finally he spoke. I haven't tasted real food in 70 years. His voice was quieter now, almost reflective. They keep me alive with chemical nutrients. Efficient. Tasteless. Enough to prevent death, not enough to call it living. Emily felt anger rising in her chest. 70 years. She couldn't even imagine it. What are you? She asked. Why are you here? The dragon's head lifted slightly, and she saw pride flicker in his eyes despite his broken condition. I am Varakthos, last of the Starborn. His voice carried a sorrow deeper than oceans, heavier than mountains. My people built cities from song and shaped planets with thought. We were guardians of balance, keepers of ancient wisdom. The Vrelian Concorde wanted us to serve them, to use our power to crush other worlds into submission. He paused, and the chains pulsed brighter, as if responding to his emotion. I refused. So they destroyed my world and chained me here as a warning to others who might resist. His golden eyes locked onto hers. I have been in this chamber for 300 years, human. And in all that time, you are the first person who has asked when I last ate. Emily stood there, staring at this ancient being, and made a decision that would change everything. "I'll be back tomorrow," she said quietly. With real food. Emily couldn't stop thinking about the prisoner. She'd returned to her quarters, filed her maintenance report without mentioning the chamber, and tried to sleep. But sleep wouldn't come. Every time she closed her eyes, all she could see were those ancient golden eyes, filled with pain that had turned into something cold and empty over centuries of suffering. She lay in her bunk, staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the station's engines. 300 years. The number kept circling in her mind. 300 years of chains and darkness and slow starvation. How did someone survive that? How did they keep breathing when everything had been taken from them? Around midnight, Emily gave up on sleep. She went to the small communal kitchen that the human workers shared. Most of the crew ate the standard station rations, compressed nutrition bars and synthetic protein shakes. Efficient but tasteless, just like everything the Vrelians designed. But Emily had brought supplies from Earth. Real ingredients. Her mother had taught her that food was more than fuel. It was comfort. It was home. It was love made visible. She pulled out chicken, fresh vegetables from the hydroponics bay, and egg noodles. Her hands moved automatically through the familiar motions. Chopping carrots and celery. Sautéing onions until they turned golden. Adding broth and letting everything simmer together. The kitchen filled with warmth and the smell of something real, something made with care instead of printed from a machine. The soup was simple. Nothing fancy. Just the kind of thing her mother used to make when Emily was sick as a child. But as she poured it into a thermal container, Emily knew it was exactly right. This wasn't about impressing anyone. It was about showing someone that they mattered. The next evening, she packed the container carefully in her toolkit and headed back toward the forbidden sector. Her heart pounded as she approached the security checkpoints. Getting past the protocols was easier than she expected, which almost made it worse. The Vrelians were efficient, but they were also predictable. They'd built their security systems on logic and probability. They never imagined someone would be stupid enough to visit the most dangerous prisoner on the station. Who would risk their life for a defeated enemy? Emily would. Because it was the right thing to do. The tunnel seemed longer this time. Or maybe that was just her nerves. When she finally emerged into the vast chamber, Varakthos was awake, his golden eyes tracking her from the moment she appeared. He watched her approach with something like disbelief, as if he'd convinced himself that yesterday had been a hallucination. "I brought you something," Emily said, unsealing the container. The smell of home-cooked soup immediately filled the cold chamber, pushing back the darkness. Steam rose from the container, carrying the scent of chicken and vegetables and care. "They will execute you for this." Varakthos's voice was quiet, but Emily heard something new in it. Concern. He was worried about her. The Vrelians do not tolerate kindness to their prisoners. It undermines their control. "Maybe they will," Emily admitted. But even as he spoke, she could see his nostrils flare, catching the scent of real food for the first time in decades. His whole body tensed as if fighting against hope itself. "But I couldn't stop thinking about what you said. 70 years without real food. That's not right. Nobody deserves that." She held up the container, moving closer to the energy barrier that separated them. "When did you last taste something made with actual care? Not nutrient paste. Not synthetic protein. Real food made by someone who wanted you to have it." The dragon was silent for a long moment. Emily watched emotions flicker across his ancient face. Disbelief, longing, suspicion, and something that might have been the beginning of hope. Then, slowly, he lowered his massive head toward the barrier between them. The chains clinked and hummed as he moved, protesting the motion. Emily carefully tilted the container, pouring the soup through the energy field. It sizzled slightly as it passed through, but the barrier didn't stop it. Varakthos caught the soup in his mouth, and Emily watched as the ancient being closed his eyes. For a moment nothing happened. Then she saw a single tear slide down the dragon's scaled cheek, glowing faintly gold in the dim light. His whole body shuddered, not with pain but with something else. Memory. Emotion. The taste of something made with love instead of efficiency. "It's been so long," Varakthos whispered, his voice breaking. "I'd forgotten what it felt like. To taste something real." Emily poured more soup, watching him savor each mouthful like it was the most precious thing in the universe. Maybe it was. When everything has been taken from you, the smallest kindness becomes everything. "Why?" Varakthos asked, finally opening his eyes. His voice cracked with centuries of pain. "I am your enemy. My kind opposed the Concord. We lost. I lost. You owe me nothing. Why would you risk your life for me?" Emily set down the empty container and sat cross-legged on the cold stone floor in front of him. She thought about her answer carefully. This mattered. You're not my enemy, she said simply. I don't care what the Vrelians say. I don't care about their war or their politics. You're not a threat. You're not a monster. You're just someone who's been hurt for way too long. And that's wrong. It doesn't matter what species you are or what war you lost 300 years ago. Torture is torture. And I can't just walk away from that. Varakthos stared at her in silence. For the first time in 3 centuries, something shifted inside him. The cold emptiness that had kept him alive through endless darkness began to crack. Warmth seeped in through the gaps. Not much. Just enough to remember what hope felt like. Thank you, he whispered. Thank you, Emily Brooks. Over the following weeks, Emily returned every night she could slip away. She brought soup, sometimes stew, once even apple pie that she'd baked in the station's small kitchen. The other human workers thought she was crazy for baking in her off hours, but they didn't ask too many questions. That was the thing about working for the Vrelians. Everyone learned to mind their own business. But more than food, Emily brought conversation. She asked about his world, his people, what the stars looked like from a planet that no longer existed. At first, Varakthos was hesitant. 300 years of silence had made him forget how to talk about the things he'd lost. But Emily was patient. She'd sit on the cold floor with her back against the wall, eating her own dinner while she waited for him to find the words. Slowly the stories came. Varakthos told her about the Starborn, beings who lived in harmony with cosmic forces, who could hear the songs of distant galaxies and feel the heartbeat of stars. They built cities from crystallized memory that glowed with the thoughts of everyone who'd ever lived there. Their architecture was alive, growing and changing based on the emotions of the inhabitants. We didn't use tools the way you do, Varakthos explained one evening. We shaped reality with intention and will. A starborn child learning to build would sing to the stones and the stones would answer. Our whole civilization was built on connection, on listening, on understanding that everything in the universe is alive in its own way. Emily listened, fascinated. That sounds beautiful. It was. His voice carried an ache that made her chest hurt. We believed that the greatest strength was knowing when not to use power. Any fool can destroy. True wisdom is in creation, in preservation, in choosing peace when war would be easier. He told her about crystal forests that sang in harmonies humans couldn't hear. About oceans that held memories of everyone who'd ever touched their waters. About his mate and younglings, lost when the Vrelians reduced his world to ash and dust. They gave us a choice, Varakthos said one night, his voice harder. Serve or die. Most species choose to serve. It's logical. It's survival. But the Vrelians don't just conquer worlds, Emily. They erase souls. They take everything that makes a people unique and grind it down into uniform obedience. They wanted me to use my abilities to crush other worlds into submission. To be their weapon. And you said no, Emily said quietly. I chose these chains instead. Varakthos looked at the glowing restraints that had held him for 3 centuries. I watched them destroy everything I loved. I let them lock me in this darkness. But I never became their weapon. That was the one choice they couldn't take from me. Emily felt tears on her cheeks. She wiped them away quickly, but not before Varakthos noticed. You're a good person, she said, her voice thick with emotion. You know that, right? What you did, choosing torture over becoming a monster, that takes incredible strength. The dragon stared at her with wonder, as if seeing something he'd thought was extinct. I had forgotten what goodness looked like, Emily Brooks. I'd convinced myself it didn't exist anymore. Thank you for reminding me. But their time was running out and neither of them knew it. Lieutenant Krex was young for a Vrelian officer, ambitious and sharp-eyed. He'd been assigned to monitor the station's security feeds, a boring job that most officers avoided. But Krex was thorough. He noticed patterns that others missed. Like the convenience system failures in Sector 7 that happened exactly when the human maintenance worker named Emily Brooks ended her shift. Like the power fluctuations in the forbidden chamber that coincided with those failures. He watched the recordings carefully, using enhancement protocols to peer through the static. And there she was, the human girl sitting on the floor talking to the prisoner. Bringing him food. Treating the station's most dangerous captive like he was a person instead of a weapon in storage. Krex reported his findings to Commander Thorax, the station's brutal overseer. Thorax was a massive Vrelian with scales like iron plates and eyes that showed no mercy. He'd built his reputation on crushing dissent before it could spread. Sentiment, he believed, was a disease that needed to be cut out at the root. When Krex showed him the recordings, Thorax smiled. It was a terrible sight on a Vrelian's face, all sharp teeth and cold calculation. Perfect, Thorax said. We'll make an example. Let's teach both of them about the price of sentiment. That night, when Emily arrived at the chamber with a container of chicken stew, she knew immediately that something was wrong. The usual darkness was broken by harsh floodlights. And there, in the center of the chamber, stood Commander Thorax with 6 armed guards flanking him. Emily's blood turned to ice. The human shows compassion to a war criminal, Thorax announced, his voice echoing off the stone walls. This is exactly why your species will never matter in the galactic order. You're too weak to make hard choices. Too soft. Too emotional. He walked toward her slowly, like a predator that knew its prey couldn't escape. The guards raised their weapons, energy rifles that hummed with lethal power. You think kindness is strength? Thorax continued. Let me show you what real strength looks like. Let me show you what happens to those who forget their place. He raised his weapon toward Emily. Behind him, Varakthos strained against his chains, roaring in fury, but the quantum dampeners held him motionless. Let the dragon watch, Thorax said, his finger moving to the trigger. Let him see what his new friend's compassion has earned her. Emily stood frozen, unable to move, unable to breathe. She could see Varakthos fighting the chains with everything he had, could hear his anguished roar echoing through the chamber. And then the chains began to glow. Not the usual cold blue. This light was different. Golden. Warm. Growing brighter with every passing second. The light started as a golden flicker in the quantum dampening chains. Just a spark at first, barely visible against the cold blue glow that had pulsed through the void stone for 3 centuries. Then it spread, racing along the metal like fire caught in dry grass, growing brighter with each passing second. The temperature in the chamber spiked. Emily felt the heat wash over her face. That's impossible, Thorax breathed, his weapon lowering slightly. His confident smile vanished. The void stone chains can't. Varakthos roared, and the sound shook the entire station. It wasn't just noise. It was power made audible, centuries of compressed fury and pain and hope all released at once. The floor vibrated beneath Emily's feet. Dust rained from the ceiling. The guards stumbled, dropping to their knees with their hands over their ears. Even Thorax staggered backward, his eyes wide with something Emily had never seen on a Vrelian's face before. Fear. The chains didn't shatter. They melted. The void stone, which had held the starborn captive for 300 years, liquefied like ice under a blowtorch. It dripped to the floor in glowing rivulets, hissing and steaming as it pooled around Varakthos's feet. The quantum energy that had suppressed his power for so long dissipated into the air, crackling like lightning. The dragon rose to his full height for the first time in centuries. His wings unfurled, massive and magnificent, stretching nearly wall to wall in the enormous chamber. The membrane between the wing bones glowed with inner light, like stained glass with stars behind it. His scales, which had been dull and lifeless, now blazed with radiance that pushed back every shadow in the room. But he wasn't attacking. Emily noticed that immediately, even through her shock. Varakthos moved with careful precision, positioning himself between her and Thorax. A living shield. Despite everything, the centuries of torture, the pain, the rage that must have been burning inside him, his first instinct was to protect her. How? Thorax demanded, scrambling backward across the stone floor. His weapon clattered away, forgotten. The void stone feeds on despair. On isolation. On hopelessness. You should be weaker than ever. You were dying. Varakthos looked down at the Vrelian commander, and Emily saw something in his expression that made her chest ache. Not hatred. Pity. That is your mistake, Varakthos said, his voice resonating with power that made the very air vibrate. The remaining guards dropped to their knees, unable to stand against the weight of his presence. You understand chains and weapons and fear. But you've never understood what truly gives strength. He looked down at Emily, who stood transfixed, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. When his golden eyes met hers, they were warm, grateful, alive in a way they hadn't been before. For 300 years I had nothing, Varakthos continued, his gaze returning to Thorax. No hope, no connection, no reason to fight. I was empty, hollow. The chains drank that emptiness like water, and they grew stronger every year. I fed my own prison with my despair. His wings spread wider, and the light from his scales grew brighter, filling the chamber with warmth. But this human, this small, supposedly weak human that your empire dismisses as insignificant, she gave me something your Concord doesn't understand. Something you can't measure or calculate or forge into a weapon. His voice dropped lower, more intense. She gave me kindness when cruelty was easier. She gave me companionship when isolation was safer. She gave me a reason to care again even when caring meant risking everything. Emily felt tears streaming down her face, but she didn't wipe them away. She couldn't look away from Varakthos, from the absolute certainty in his voice. She reminded me what it means to be alive, the dragon said. And Voidstone cannot hold a heart that has remembered love. The chamber erupted in chaos. The guards scrambled for their weapons, but Varakthos moved faster than anything that large should be able to move. Emily watched in amazement as he disarmed them one by one. But he was careful, terrifyingly, impossibly careful. He destroyed their weapons with precise strikes, melting the metal with his breath, but he didn't harm the guards themselves. When one soldier raised a blade in desperation, Varakthos simply plucked it from his hand and bent it into a useless curve. No killing. No brutality. Even freed, even powerful beyond measure, he showed the restraint and wisdom that defined the Starborn. The same qualities that had made him refuse to become the Vrelian's weapon 3 centuries ago. Thorax tried to run, but Varakthos' tail swept across his path, blocking the exit. The commander fell to his knees, trembling. Go, Varakthos said quietly. Tell your Concord what happened here. Tell them that chains can only hold bodies, not spirits. Tell them that humanity possesses something more dangerous than any weapon. He turned to Emily, extending a massive clawed hand. His talons could have shredded steel, but his touch was gentle when he offered it to her. Emily Brooks, he said, his voice carrying both question and hope. I offer you a choice. Come with me into the stars or stay where it's safe. I will not judge either path. Alarms shrieked throughout the station, red emergency lights flashing in the corridors beyond. The Vrelian fleet would arrive within hours. Staying meant interrogation, possibly execution. But leaving meant abandoning everything familiar, stepping into a universe she barely understood. Emily looked at Varakthos' outstretched hand. She thought about her father's words, about fixing what's broken, about doing what's right even when it's hard. She took his hand without hesitation. Let's go, she said and smiled through her tears. I've always wanted to see the stars. They escaped in a stolen transport, Varakthos' power shielding them from the station's weapons. Emily strapped herself into the co-pilot seat as the dragon's energy wrapped around the small ship like invisible armor. Energy blasts from the station's defense cannons hit the shields and scattered harmlessly into space, unable to penetrate the barrier of pure will that Varakthos had created. Hold on, Varakthos said, his massive form somehow fitting into the pilot's area through sheer determination. His claws moved across the controls with surprising delicacy. Hyperspace in 3, 2. The stars stretched into lines of light, and Station Varkle vanished behind them. As they jumped to hyperspace, Emily looked back at the shrinking station through the rear viewport and smiled. Her hands were still shaking from adrenaline, but she felt more alive than she had in years. They're going to tell everyone that humans are dangerous now, she said, half laughing, half crying. Varakthos turned his golden eyes toward her, and there was something fierce and proud in his expression. Good, he replied. Let them. Let them fear what happens when someone shows compassion. Let them wonder what other impossible things your species might do. In the weeks that followed, the story spread across the galaxy like wildfire. The tale of a human girl who freed an unstoppable prisoner with nothing but soup became a legend that the Vrelian Concord tried desperately to suppress. They sent out official statements calling it propaganda. They threatened anyone caught spreading the story. They even tried to claim that Varakthos had manipulated Emily, that she'd been under some kind of mind control. But they couldn't stop it. The story was too good, too pure, too fundamentally threatening to everything the Concord stood for. It spread through encrypted messages, whispered conversations, and underground networks. Every species that had been conquered, every prisoner that had been forgotten, every worker who'd been told that compassion was weakness, they all heard about Emily Brooks and her soup. On stations throughout the Empire, something changed. Human workers started treating prisoners with dignity. They shared food, offered conversation, asked questions about the lives being destroyed in the name of order and efficiency. A maintenance worker named Tommy Chin on Station Helix began bringing meals to detained refugees. A human medic named Rachel Foster started sitting with dying prisoners, holding their hands, making sure they didn't die alone. Other species watched the humans and began to remember their own capacity for compassion. A Tarvian guard let a prisoner see his children one last time. A Colonian administrator falsified documents to free a political detainee. Small acts, each one a crack in the Concord's foundation. The Vrelians tried to crack down. They fired human workers, increased surveillance, made examples through public punishment. But every punishment created 10 new resistors. The empire that had conquered hundreds of worlds was being undermined by the simple act of caring. They'd built their power on making people afraid to connect, afraid to feel, afraid to see each other as anything more than categories and functions. And now humans were teaching the galaxy to feel again. Varakthos and Emily reached a hidden world called Haven, tucked away in a nebula that scrambled sensor readings. It was beautiful, a green planet with purple skies where freed prisoners had gathered to form a coalition. Dozens of species lived there, once enemies, now united by a single purpose, ending the Concord's reign of calculated cruelty. Emily stood in the central hall, overwhelmed by the diversity around her. There were beings made of crystal, others that floated like living clouds, some with 6 arms and others with no visible body at all. All of them had one thing in common: they'd all been hurt by the Vrelians and they'd all chosen to fight back. Varakthos addressed the growing resistance, his voice carrying to every corner of the vast chamber without needing amplification. The Vrelians believe that power comes from chains and fear, he declared. They think sentiment is weakness and compassion is inefficiency. They've built an empire on the idea that caring is dangerous, that connection makes you vulnerable. But they're wrong. He gestured to Emily, who stood beside him, feeling small but determined. This human showed me that the strongest force in the universe is choosing kindness when cruelty would be easier. She risked everything for a stranger. For an enemy. And in doing so, she broke chains that were designed to be unbreakable. The crowd erupted in cheers from 100 different species, their voices blending into a sound that was somehow universal despite their differences. That is why humanity will reshape the stars, Varakthos continued, his eyes blazing with conviction. Not with weapons or technology, but with the simple revolutionary act of treating every being as worthy of dignity. They see people where others see categories. They offer hands where others offer chains. Emily watched as the coalition began to plan their resistance, species working together in ways the Concord had tried to make impossible. In the corner of the hall, she'd set up a small cooking station. A group of young refugees gathered around her, Tarvians, Colonians, even a few brave Vrelian defectors, watching as she taught them how to make soup. It's not about the recipe, Emily explained, stirring the pot. It's about taking time to make something with care. It's about sitting down with someone and sharing a meal. That's how you build trust. That's how you remember that we're all just people trying to survive. A young Tarvian refugee, barely more than a child, looked up at her with wide eyes. Do you think we can win? She asked. The Concord is so big. So powerful. Emily smiled, remembering a dragon in chains and a choice to do what was right instead of what was safe. One bowl of soup at a time, she said, ladling out portions for everyone gathered around her. We already have. Somewhere in the distant dark, Commander Thorax sat in his office on Station Varkle, reviewing reports. Uprisings on 17 stations. Efficiency down across 40 sectors. Guards refusing orders. Workers organizing. And every single incident started the same way, a human offering food to a prisoner. He stared at the reports, finally understanding what made humanity dangerous. It wasn't their technology or their strength. They were still weak by galactic standards, still new to the stars. It was their refusal to stop caring. Their inability to see suffering without trying to fix it. Their stubborn, illogical, beautiful insistence that every being deserved dignity. The Vrelians had conquered worlds with superior weapons and tactics. But they'd never faced an enemy like this. An enemy armed with soup and kindness and the revolutionary belief that compassion was strength. And for the first time in his career, Thorax wondered if the Concord could survive it.